Okay, thank you for joining the Montana Book Festival for this conversation with Deirdre McNamer, conducted by Chad Dundas, presented to you in partnership with the Great Falls Festival of the Book and the Great Falls Public Library. My name is Lauren Korn. I'm here on behalf of the festival, and I'm excited to welcome you to this year's virtual events. As I said, I'm here today with Deirdre McNamer and Chad Dundas, who are going to be chatting about Dee's 1994 novel, One Sweet Quarrel. Deirdre, or Dee McNamer, grew up in Conrad and Cutbank on the Montana High Line, the granddaughter of homesteaders on both sides. She attended the University of Washington and the University of Montana, where she received a BA in journalism. She worked for more than a decade for the Associated Press and several dailies, including the Missoulian. And in 1985, she left journalism for fiction and freelancing and got an MFA at the University of Montana. Since then, she has published 4 novels: Rima in the Weeds, am I pronouncing that correctly? One Sweet Quarrel, My Russian, and Red Rover. Her 5th, Aviary, is forthcoming in April. She recently retired after teaching creative writing at UM for 25 years and remains on the faculty of the Bennington Writing Seminars in Vermont. She lives in Missoula with her husband, writer Brian Salvatore. Chad Dundas is the author of the novels The Blaze and Champion of the World, which was named a 2016 Boston Globe Best Book of the Year, as well as a finalist for the David J. Langham Senior Prize for Historical Fiction and Reading the West Book Awards. He is the co-host of the weekly Co-Main Event MMA podcast and an executive producer on the upcoming history and true crime podcast, Death in the West. He lives in Missoula with his wife and children. All right, you two, I'm going to ask you to take it away.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.
Thanks for that introduction. Dee, I'm glad that we finally get to do this.
I am too, Chad.
As Lauren mentioned at the top, like we were supposed to do this at one time under much grander surroundings. We were supposed to be the keynote gala main event Q&A at the Great Falls Book Festival. I think we were supposed to be in a 1940s era ballroom. For a hot minute, there was a rumor that there were going to be actual amateur boxing matches at the event. Of course, the brainchild of the great Richard Fifield. So, shout out to him for all the work he did trying to get the Great Falls Book Festival put together before, of course, it had to be canceled due to the ongoing pandemic. But I'm glad that we get to do this anyway, despite the fact that here we are in somewhat, less grand environs, cooped up in our homes, talking to each other over the internet. I'm still excited to do it.
And I bet Richard is scheming away to do some version with costumes and events. I think we have not heard the last of that, but we'll just have to be sober-sided and make do now.
Yeah. I guess, we're going to talk a little bit about historical fiction today and the process of turning historical fact into what we hope is an engaging experience for the modern readers of fiction, and how we both approached writing about the early 20th century in our home state of Montana. And I guess we will probably touch on the intersection of sports and fiction as we focus, as Lauren said, mostly on your 1994 novel, One Sweet Quarrel. And talk, I think, a little bit about my book, Champion of the World, that came out in 2016. Your book talks about the championship boxing match between Jack Dempsey and Tommy Gibbons that happened in Shelby, Montana in 1923. And my book focuses on primarily on the world of professional wrestling in the early 1920s. And so I guess to start off, I kind of wanted to ask you just about how you conceived of One Sweet Quarrel. I guess everybody who follows you and your work knows that you feel a special connection to your hometown of Cutbank and writing about the history of the Montana High Line. When it came to One Sweet Quarrel, how did you decide you wanted to zoom in on that particular aspect of the early 1900s, and ultimately why did you decide to make that huge spectacle of a boxing match between Dempsey and Gibbons one of the centerpieces of the book?
Well, one reason was that my grandfather was directly involved in organizing, or this grand, crazy scheme that these guys hatched in Shelby, in the deep winter of 1923, before the fight. I guess it might have been, they were meeting the year before too, but I had heard about it, just growing up. And I I found myself at that point in my life, I was in my 40s by the time I wrote it, and I still had not solved this enigma and this kind of worrying thing about my upbringing and the place and the people I grew up with, who I feel really still to this day quite close to. But there was this combination of these people who came out there, particularly in the early part of the 20th century, of kind of innocence and grandiosity. What they did was basically raise the better part of $4.5 million in 2020 money, with factoring in interest rates, but or inflation rather. But it was just, there were 1,000 people in this town, and they wanted to have a stunt, basically, to draw attention to this oil field that had some kind of activity, promising, and then it kind of flagged. And everybody up there had been through a bunch of bad years, drought, just terrible weather, the flu, World War I. And so, but they went ahead and did it. And a lot of people up there just lost their shirts, and banks went broke. And it just, I was tormented about why they would go ahead. Why would they keep just saying, we're working with this very sophisticated fight organizer, Doc Kearns. He was just a shark, right. 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 they had to come up with, and they just knocked themselves out to do it. And knowing it, I think on some level that it was probably going to be a huge failure, or could be. And so it was just me trying to kind of figure out my own people in a way, and those impulses, which when I reread Champion of the World recently, I realized that I think I see some of that at work with you and your interests as well, of like, who are, this is a mean world out there. And the sports writers in New York called Shelby people the babes of the prairies. So it's like, and I'd like to hear you talk about that a little bit too. It's just, these rough times, early 20s, wide open, bootlegging, fixed fights, cons of all kind. And then these people just scrambling to continue to be involved in these very risky undertakings. Yeah. So that was part of it. And part of it was that I also had documentary evidence of via a whole stash of letters between my grandfather and his mother back in Batavia, Illinois, and his sister, who was trying to be a singing star in New York at the same time. And so I had the voices, and I knew what sort of sensitive and kind of, out of their element in some ways, people, both he and his sister, were in these big mad worlds of the 20s.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you about the research that you did for the book in a minute, but since you just mentioned the letters and your grandfather's active role in the fight, like how much McNamer family lore is in this book? There's a great scene in the book where one of the main characters stays out too late drinking in a bar, and that's when it seems like the guys get a little bit liquored up, and they decide to send this telegram to Kearns, Jack Dempsey's manager, being like, we'll give you this much money if you'll come here and defend the heavyweight title. Like how much of the stuff that's in the book is like McNamer family lore, I guess you would say.
Oh, well, my sense was that he was directly involved in probably that evening and the sending of that telegram. They had read that in the newspaper that I believe it was Montreal or Toronto had made a great big offer to get a world heavyweight championship there, and they got a lot of attention for that. And so they thought, well, why can't Shelby get a lot of attention for a similar sort of sort of grand gesture? And so I believe my grandfather, who was bore more than a few similarities to to the main character, the Jerry Malone character in One Sweet Quarrel, was in on it very, very directly. And he was, I believe, the secretary of the Fight Club, you know, trying to organize all this stuff. And he was always sort of proud of it. You know, it was like, oh man, we got Dempsey there. It was actually a good fight, even though Gibbons lost. It was a decision and went 15 rounds. And, you know, it was on the front pages of the New York Times for every New York paper for weeks. And there's this kind of, you know, wow, we did it, you know, built this arena on 6 acres, you know, to seat 40,000 people. And in about a week and a half, it seemed. And so it wasn't, he had tickets, he had his tickets still. And I think he was quite proud that it happened, and that there was just this chutzpah at work, that this little town, the underdog taking on the big powers. The women in Shelby that I talked to, and I suspect perhaps my grandmother, although I never talked to her directly about it, were not so happy about the fight. A lot of savings accounts were depleted.
Yeah.
A lot of deferred expenses were deferred, you know. They were broke. Most people in town were just broke afterwards.
And yet, like, one of the many magical things that One Sweet Quarrel does is that in the wake of that fight, and after everyone knows that financially it was a huge flop and a disaster, you get this wonderful sprawling scene of the aftermath in town where you know, many of the men are wandering around with their pockets pulled out, inside out, and yet it's kind of like a party atmosphere. Like the fight is over, and they pulled it off, but they did in fact almost bankrupt the town. And it seemed like there was sort of like an exuberance there rather than a mourning, which I thought was a really fun and great choice in the book. Does that reflect what actually happened also?
Yes, you know, the reporters, there were so many reporters there just doing like inches and inches and inches, column inches a day. So I went and did a lot of research just in the press coverage by some of the luminaries of the day, you know, Haywood Broun and Damon Runyon, and and they recorded in part what happened afterwards too. Doc Kearns took off on the train with all his money, got out of there as fast as he could. Dempsey got out of there as fast as he could. Tommy Gibbons, you know, he stuck around for a while, and the people in town really liked him. And I think there was this vindication of the underdog in a way. You know, we showed them something they never thought we were capable of, you know, and I think any of us who have grown up in small towns, sometimes it can feel like long swaths of time go by when nothing very big happens. And I think it was actually just on some level very exciting to have that go on in Shelby with 1,000 people.
Yeah. In terms of research, one of the unexpected and strange things that happened to me when I was writing Champion of the World was, I think I might have been a little bit naive about the notion of diving into writing about the 20s in this world that I had never sort of experienced myself at all. And I found, like, as I was trying to write, there was so much like incidental research that I didn't necessarily see coming, where basically I would be in the middle of a paragraph and suddenly be like, would a traveling circus in the 1920s have electric lights? And I would have to go, like, you know, ferret out that one specific fact. And essentially the manuscript would be at a standstill until I figured out that question. So ultimately, one of the things I did was I went and wrote a bunch of that book in the basement of the Mansfield Library here in Missoula on campus at the University of Montana, so that when questions like that popped up, I could literally just stand up and go into the stacks and see if I could find the answer.
Right.
When it came to writing One Sweet Quarrel, like, what kind of research did you do for the book, and how exhaustive was it?
It was exhaustive. and interesting, as you say. Like you'll be going along and there'll be some little side detail and you go, what? How, people were collecting comet dust in Manhattan when Halley's Comet went over in 1910. They were holding up little blue bottles to catch it. And, and then you just, that is recorded, that is on the record. And then you start to kind of think about that detail or make sure it's accurate. And it was just, I kept always getting waylaid in an interesting, often interesting kind of way. It slows down the, efficiency of the writing, but I really enjoyed it. What I did was I went to the old annex of the New York Public Library and went there day after day for, weeks, maybe a month. And, that was 1994. It is so much easier now, to find them. They had these horrible old microfiche, gizmos and terrible copy machines. And it was physically very demanding. But what they had was, I realized that every single day, New Yorkers were picking up the one of 7 or 8 or 9 dailies then that were going full bore. And there was Shelby and the fight on the front page. Was it going to happen? Were they going to come through with the money? All the reporters going out there, cooling their heels for weeks because everything got hung up. And so I did that. And I also, I went she was really my great aunt, this character that went off to New York to try to be a singer. I knew she wasn't a very successful singer, but I knew that she sang with a whistler named Margaret McKee. So then I went, well, I'll just find out what Margaret McKee sounded like, and maybe I can find the record that Daisy was, singing along with the whistler on. And I did, and so I think that was at the Lincoln Center archives. And so you have a day like that and you go, well, I don't know what this counts for exactly in telling this story, but it's a fun, I found it to be a fun kind of research. And I felt in reading yours that, your carefulness with the detail, and also the fact in yours that you switch around in Champion of the World from a close interior point, an interior point of view that's quite close to the character, in a really convincing way, because you have the actual language of the era, right? They're going to do the hop down to San Francisco, when they're traveling, or just this lingo that I felt that you used in a way that enriched the telling of the story so much without calling attention to it as, oh, guess how they talked then. It was just in their heads. Yeah. Which that takes a long time of research, I think. It's like, oh, yeah, that's that expression for that.
Right. Yeah. Luckily, I was writing about wrestlers, so I have no shortage of lingo, especially at that time. They kind of spoke their own foreign language. But like and I read some historical accounts of wrestling at that time. And I went and looked at a lot of different newspaper accounts of various matches and things like that. And it was a very tumultuous time for wrestling back then, because a bunch of advantageous, pretty smart, really, promoters had started to figure out over the previous couple of decades that they could make a lot more money pretending to wrestle than actually doing it for real. It had a lot to do with the formation of the modern sporting culture. Because frankly, when you would have a legitimate wrestling match, 2 guys who were really good wrestlers would get together and they would roll around for literally 6 hours. And by the time of the 1920s rolled around, nobody wanted to see that anymore. There's actually some accounts that in retrospect are kind of funny, talking about how audiences want to thrill to the fast-paced action of baseball. In those days, they don't want to sit in a smoky theater and watch two guys wrestle for 6 or 8 hours. And so like the wrestling promoters of the day had to make this kind of cutthroat decision to become a vaudeville act really more than anything else. And
Right.
one of the things that I found in those accounts that inspired part of Champion of the World was that didn't really go down that easily for actual legitimate wrestlers who had spent their entire lives trading on being the toughest, most athletic people around. Now suddenly they're like, they thought promoters wanted them to be ballet dancers. And so it didn't go over all that well. But to me, like that was some of the more surprising aspects of the research that I did. And like I ended up finding some sources that I might not have expected to be all that helpful were actually incredibly helpful. When it came to your book, like were you surprised by any of the sources, or did you end up gleaning a lot of information from an area where you didn't expect that it would be all that helpful for your purposes?
Well, I was at a disadvantage. I had carried a disadvantage that you didn't, which is that I'm an idiot about sports.
Oh, I have the disadvantage of being an idiot as well.
I had never seen a boxing match. I finally did go to one up in Great Falls, just so I could sort of see all the sweat and stuff, but up close. But what I found was this sleazy looking place in New York City called the Big Fights, Inc. It had no windows. It was in Midtown. This, chain smoking secretary, really tough sounding, took me into this room and darkened all the windows, and they had the footage of the Dempsey-Gibbons fight. And, as you could get it in 1923. And so all of that was a revelation and a surprise to me. The lighting was very harsh, unmodulated, and you could just sort of feel how hot it was, how empty this, tinderbox of an arena was. It was just all fresh cut pine, in 100-degree weather, sitting there, everybody coming in with their big cigars. And but the people were just like little peas at the bottom of a cup. It was just you just seeing it, even that crudely, was a revelation to me, especially considering how staged things are now. Almost anything is. It's just so smooth and so many angles. And this was just so crude and scary. Like when Dempsey walked in, it was just like I just got scared looking at him. He just looked, he brined his skin, he tried to make it into leather so it wouldn't crack as much when he got hit. Right. And he just had this invulnerable look, and Gibbons, you could kind of see him, he had this kind of helpful look, he was really quite good, but there was you could just feel the emanations of their presences, even, so the visual stuff, I was very lucky to have access to, because I, especially in that old format, it somehow intensified the drama of it for me. And I did a lot of research on who came out there then and who the people were who were, involved in this whole scheme and event, and went over to the Montana Historical Society and listened to many, many oral histories and of people who came out. There was a project funded in the 80s where college kids went around and interviewed sort of the last of those homesteaders. And so that's a great collection. I just recommend it to any Montanan. It just gives you such a new look at, sort of what preceded us not so long ago. But what it taught me about memory and how old people, one woman couldn't quite remember the name of the guy that she was married to, for like about 20 years, but she remembered impeccably how a Chinese cook in a railroad restaurant in someplace like Glendive would spit on the stove to see how hot it was, some detail like that, or what, what the flax feels. A lot of them are growing flax up there as their first attempt to grow something that made them any money. And so there were just these rolling fields of that beautiful blue color, and I never saw that growing up. Nobody grows flax up there that I know of now. And so those kinds of details that people like us just love to have available to appropriate, to enliven our narratives are just, we're in those two places maybe the most, the papers, the newspapers, and the oral histories. And then the personal one was this cache of letters that I was about a year into the writing of this book when my parents moved from one house to another and found this kind of dampish box of letters in the basement. Somebody had stashed somewhere and at some time. And there was this correspondence in which my grandfather typed all of his letters. This would have been in the teens and 20s, and with carbon copies. And so the letters were conversations. They weren't just one-sided like letters usually are. He had his letter, and then he would have his mother's response.
Oh, wow.
He would have a copy of his letter. He would have Daisy in New York's response. And so I realized that he felt himself to be part of some kind of history that somebody might want to know about at some time. That was my sense.
Yeah.
So that was a great gift.
Yeah, that's an amazing find right there.
Yeah, it was.
But so when you're writing fiction, when you're writing a historical novel, and as I said at the top, like the ultimate goal is to take this big pile of research and turn it into a pleasing and hopefully engaging experience for the reader. One of the things that I found myself kind of worried about was that I was going to do too much research, or that like the book was going to feel stuffy because of the research that I had done. Like when you were writing, like how did that question occur to you? And would you say that the job as a novelist is different compared to what a historian, just like a straight historian, would do with all that research?
I think that, yes, I think there is a danger that the research can kind of take over. And, but I think that in both of our cases, we just like language so much that really fights that kind of desiccated, this happened, then that happened way of recounting something. I'm just going to read one of your sentences, just as I wanted to use just a small example of that. You've got, they're at their camp, the wrestling camp. Where is that? Sealy Lake?
It's sort of a fictional location, but they're kind of up near Butte because they wanted to be near a city center kind of.
Oh, right. So they were up on the Continental Divide outside of Butte. Right. But the morning smelled of pine needles and sang against Taft's black eye. So this guy's got a very hurting face. And I just, that word sang, is like it shouldn't work. And it just works perfectly. It's like, it's an assault kind of, but it's also an insistence. And you get it like a reader does, I think. And that is the sort of sentence that you don't see too much in, I think, works in which, or accounts in which writers are more concerned with the facts or the chronology than they are with how that information is conveyed.
Yeah.
And the sentence is how things are conveyed. And people with a strong interest in fiction, as we both have, don't feel very happy when we're writing really dumb, stupid, utilitarian sentences all the time. They're not necessarily stupid, but they're conveyances. They're just like they haul information. That is a certain kind of writing. But I think the way that can be not undermined, but made more textured and give a reader more of an experience, is to bring in those sensory details and a little boldness with the language, so that the reader has to kind of stay alert to how something is getting said rather than just what is getting said.
Yeah.
So I think that naturally works against letting research take over. I think fiction writers research in a somewhat different way than historians do. We're looking for that detail of, I don't know, how a woman in 1910 might fix her long hair so that it actually looks bob, so she'll look cooler, going into the teens and 20s. You find oddball things like that and describe them, and they don't really serve history directly, but they invite a reader in, I think, to feel like they're there.
Yeah. This is maybe a standard question, but do you feel like the years that you spent working as a journalist inform your fiction at all? Or did you just have to deprogram yourself to do this different kind of writing?
Oh, it totally helped.
Yeah.
The only thing I had to work against after I sort of made this shift was trying to make things presentable too fast. I was used to working on deadlines, and I knew I could do it. I mean, I would just, by this time, it would be presentable. It would work. And I felt very uncomfortable for a while with the process in fiction of having just messes that are just kind of hanging around on your table. You just hope that you don't get struck dead by a car before you come back again and everybody finds your rough drafts, because it's just that kind of musing, sloppy stuff. And that made me uneasy. But practicing journalism, first of all, I think it's an extremely valuable thing to do. And a lot of people I've known have done it a lot better than I ever did. And it's so necessary now, I think, to reinstall some kind of integrity to the reporting process. But apart from that, you get to talk to people who wouldn't otherwise talk to you. When you're a journalist, you're a reporter, you get to ask them questions. And I'm not a extremely outgoing person or the kind of person that talks to strangers, on the street, really. But you get to do that in journalism as part of your job. You get to learn about a lot of stories that people carry around with them. And you have a lot of pressure to be really clear and exact to the extent that you can in the time that you have. And you finish things. Journalists know that they can get something done and it can go into the paper and it goes out into the world. And a lot of people who I think have written only fiction, they have maybe 2 or 3 projects under their bed that they just can't seem to finish, and maybe walk around with a little more doubt than someone who's been in the, sort of producing journalism world about whether they actually can finish something.
Yeah. Well, the reason that I asked the question of style is that one of the things that I really admire about One Sweet Quarrel is that, like, the novel has this very sweeping feel, and specifically the way that you use the omniscient narrator to kind of zoom way out from the action at some time. And in so doing, you're really able to provide the reader with this very broad sense of the world and like what is happening. And at the same time, you also manage to stay very tight on the internal life of the characters. Like it does this amazing thing that I could never do in a million years, where it zooms way out and then it zooms in, and it has this very interesting effect of giving you a sense of the world, but also making even the most minor characters in the book feel real and lived in. How did you strike that balance? How did you do that, I guess is my question. How did you strike that balance?
Well, I think I think one of my obsessions as a writer has always been time and how time works and how time is experienced. And for most people, it really isn't chronological. Yeah, I don't think. I think it's more like, I think Nabokov talked about time as being kind of like a folded Persian rug, where you try to, what happens is you know, one part of it kind of comes up against another part. They maybe share the same pattern, and that's how you recognize that it's your life and your memories and so on, which I'm not doing a very good job of explaining, but I'm not very, I guess I should just be negative and say I'm not very interested in chronological accounts. I just never have been strictly chronological, because that isn't how I remember, and it isn't how I think most people remember, that for one thing. But then if you're going to just skip, I think it can make readers nervous if you then just kind of go, well, now it's 1973, and then, oh, now it's, you know, 1923, and here she is old, here she is young, without maybe some kind of authoritative presence. And that's why I brought in what amounts to, I think of it as a kind of a stage manager, you know, with his voice comes out every now and then saying, kind of directing the reader how to view all this. Look at them, it will say this way. Look at them, how young they are, how they couldn't in their wildest dreams imagine what they were in for in the next 6 years. So that's not God exactly, but it's more like a manager, a stage manager. Just, you know, you kind of walk back from the action and point to somebody and say, you know, she doesn't have a clue right now, or you know, this is as happy as she would ever be, you know, something really grand like that. I got a lot of pushback on that. I mean, it basically lost me my first publisher.
Oh no!
Because I didn't want to write a book that was like my first novel, Rima and the Weeds. I wanted to try a kind of formal adventure, you know, which is what you're talking about, this jumping around in time and zooming way in and coming way out. And how do you not lose your reader in the process of doing that? And that didn't meet with a lot of pleasure from my editor. It was like, you know, what are you doing? They wanted kind of Rima in the Weeds part 2, I think, and I was kind of done with that coming of age sort of story. And so it was my worst selling book by far. It wasn't publicized very well. They didn't buy my next book. I had to go shopping it around again, you know. So you pay a price. I mean, I felt, well, I paid a price for this adventure that I wanted to go on stylistically and formally. And I don't regret it at all. When I read back through it now, yeah, I could have done some things differently, but I think it's kind of, I still find it an interesting way to think about a story, you know. Yeah. So I guess my takeaway from that is, if you want to try something, nobody's going to make much money in fiction anyway, unless you sell something to the movies. Yeah. So try it, you know, and if it feels like it's right for the subject and for the characters, just go with it. I don't regret it.
Well, I'm gonna editorialize then, because I think the book is a damn triumph. And like, having read it 3 times now, like,
oh, Chad.
I don't think when I first read it in the late 90s, when I was a much younger person, I really liked it, but I don't think I fully understood the craft of it. When I read it now, it is one of those books that is so good that it kind of makes me mad. Just because I'm reading it and I'm just like, what sorcery is this? How is she doing this? How is she accomplishing all of this stuff that seems like magic, but also seems like I can't even begin to figure out how I would do it? Like, I just think it's beyond me. So give me the name of that publisher and I'm going to write them a really nasty letter right now. Because
You
I think that
could
it's one of the
find some really mean wrestler type, you know.
well, and like I think it's like one of the great Montana books, and I also think it's like one of the great sports books that I've ever read, which I hope you take as a compliment. I don't mean to
I do.
diminish it in any way.
Oh boy, do I.
It's
Yeah.
a sports book, but like specifically like I was going to ask you about this earlier, but the scene where Jerry and TT Wilkins go to Jack Dempsey's training camp is some of the best boxing writing that I've ever read. Like you read that scene, and to me as a person who still in some way like covers combat sports and interacts with professional fighters, I read that scene and it seems, you know, as wild and kind of over the top as it is with them leading big cats around on leashes with jeweled collars and things like that. It also totally seems to me like a thing that could exist in 2020. Like that's when you get to the point of being that, you know, the heavyweight champion of the world, you're the biggest star in the sport, you have more money than you know what to do with. Like those are the kinds of environments that those people cultivate. And as I read it, it just seems so well rendered and also so like kind of strikingly modern or now that it really kind of blew me away. I was going to ask you when you mentioned earlier about the sports writers of the day, how much of that scene was like gleaned from their reporting and like what kind of writing they did and what kind of characters you think those people were back in those days.
A lot of it came from those reporters. I mean, they were cooling their heels, you know, they had to send, they had been staked to cover this thing, and they had to keep sending back reports. So they were sending all these details about, you know, the lion cub on the leash and the floozies and the dope and the, you know, just that all the kind of seedy undercurrents where that came, the details came from those newspaper accounts. The way that I have found to enliven them one more notch for me is to then place a character among the details who is trying to read it. You know, like these two guys from Shelby, you know, going, well, oh God, this is, you know, this is not like daily life in Shelby. This is like this really almost sinisterly dissolute scene, you know. Then I think you kind of get the best of both. You don't just go into a character's head and say, oh, it was a really shoddy scene. He was appalled by it. He wanted to go home. You notice it like the character would be noticing it. Oh my God, there comes a panther on a leash. Right. You know, so the combination, I think, of imagining how someone might feel in a particular place at a particular time, combined with a ton of detail, is you do it all the time in Champion of the World. I don't see why you think it's beyond you because you already did it. Wow. You know, it's like, I mean, it's what it is. It's just fully imagined in its details. And then you weave in, Moira felt this, Moira, you know, hated him. Here, you know, here comes so-and-so, an attitude of the way that a character feels. And then have all the details rich and right, and don't shy away from anything about them that is odd. It's good if they're odd.
Well, that's nice of you to say. In many ways, like the climax of this book is the Dempsey Gibbons fight. Yet most of the actual in-ring action of the fight that is rendered on the page is done somewhat in retrospect, as the characters gather in the 1970s to watch a vintage film of the bout. Why did you make the choice to do that instead of taking a more straightforward way and just sort of inserting a blow-by-blow account during the part of the book where they actually attend the fight in real time?
That's a really good question. And I had to think about that a while, and it has to do with the fact that I've come to know, I mean, you get as old as I am and you've been doing this as long as I have. Little glimmerings come in about how you work and what you're interested in. And one of them is that I'm more interested in edges than I am in centers. You know, I just am more interested in the frame of a event or the people on the edges, the crowd, than I am in a kind of, than I am in prioritizing what is ostensibly the big main thing that's happening. I just find myself more interested in the other. Plus, probably as a confession, I don't know boxing. I couldn't have sustained it in a believable way that someone who knows the sport better than I do could have, I think. I could talk about what it looked like to see a film of it, but I think the gaps in my knowledge and familiarity with a real 15-round boxing match would have shown through.
When you found those letters, did you know immediately that you would put actual letters in the book, or was that something that had already happened? Because those create such a nice different texture, I feel like, from the rest of the book. And even like at the end, the short excerpt of the book about life insurance that Carlton writes. Did you know that those things were going to be in there, like,
well,
verbatim, or?
I knew I didn't put them in there directly. Like Daisy Lou's letters are close, but they're not the direct letters, but she just cracked me up the way she expressed herself. And so I'll just read you one quote in this was verbatim, but she writes back about how this guy hit on her when she was auditioning for a musical performance. And Mr. Ward took me into his office and tried to kiss me, and I drew myself up and I said, Mr. Ward, if you are buying voices, mine is for sale. If, however, you are buying bodies, mine is not for sale. And then the great part, he got terrible red and he turned to me and said, Miss McNamer, I fear you have a problem. I fear you are simply too spiritual for musical comedy. You have something like that and it just has to go in. But so I wanted to capture her kind of all over the placeness and sort of the pathos of a really small town Midwest young woman trying to make it in a world that she just was way in over her head.
Do you feel like you came out of this book understanding either that time or that place differently than when you went in?
Oh, yeah. I realized how much young people in like 1918 to 25 or 26, just what they were dealing with. They were dealing with, all these kind of exhortations to get out there and make it, make your own life. They were dealing with World War I. They were dealing with a flu pandemic that killed 5,000 Montanans in 7 months, and we're at about 104 right now. They were dealing with prohibition, runaway speculation that would culminate in 1929, the stock market crash, and just big challenges, as they say now. And I think that's one reason why a lot of us like to read historical fiction and try to write it, is because you do walk away with the idea of, it's not a consolation, but it's like, you get perspective. Those people, when they were 23, were really, really into a lot and striving really hard, a lot of them. And I just kind of came away heartened by the whole idea of how our particular crises in our lives historically and economically and everything are repetitions or echoes often of what's happened in many, many fiercer forms sometimes before.
Yeah.
That kind of helps in a pandemic.
Yeah. Can you tell us about this new book?
Yeah, this one is took me way too long to write. It was, like 10 years. But it's about a group of people living in an apartment building in some place like Missoula that are all seniors, and just a fire breaks out, and there's a mystery, kind of a mystery. Looks like it might have been arson, and then just what this sort of pushes to the surface in these lives that are very quickly nearing their ends, which I consider a very dramatic time of life that everybody everybody kind of denigrates,
Right.
Or doesn't take seriously, people going through that huge drama. And it's based, of course, on, the years when my parents were declining and died, and but also the stories that a lot of people carry with them when they're in their 80s and 90s. So we'll see. It's going to be published by Milkweed Editions in April, and I'll get going on something else. What are you working on?
I am supposed to be working on a new book, and I am, but I also find that this is a kind of a challenging time to try to create, and our children are not going back to school. They're going to do the online learning academy. So I'm going to be facilitating the educational adventure of my daughter and her two cousins, I think, starting next week. I really have no idea what that's going to be like, because they try to navigate the online waters of the remote learning. And so I don't know what my schedule will be like after that, but I am working on something new, and I do want to get it done. Although, as I told Lauren, before we started to record this, as we see the news about the pandemic and book sales declining and things like that, I start to think maybe I should string this out a little bit. Maybe we wait a little bit here and see what happens. See if we get back to something approaching even like a normal marketplace, and then put a book out. So I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what happens.
Right. Yeah. And probably all these experiences that you're having now in some way will sift down, and, you might not even know what might even be part of a book 5 years down the road. Who knows? Yeah. Take notes on those kids.
Yeah, no, I need to. I will. Yeah. Dee, thanks so much for
Thank you, Chad.
talking to me about this book that I love so much, and that it's a real treat to talk about. So thanks so much.
Thanks. Okay.
And thank you both.
Oh, she's back.
Conversation. That was a wonderful conversation. I'm glad you talked about your current projects, or the publications that you'll have down the road, because that was going to be my I'm your audience question. Here's a question from the audience. So I'm glad you covered that. As a reminder to those who are watching this video today, you can purchase Dee's and Chad's books at factandfictionbooks.com. You can also purchase Montana Book Festival merchandise at montanabookfestival.com. And while you're there, I urge you to donate so that we can continue programming like this into the fall with our MBF Plus events, and into the next year for the 2021 Montana Book Festival. So again, Chad and Dee, thank you so much for joining us. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.